Hello there. This lecture is all about different types of variables and data collection methods. So I'll start off by introducing you to independent versus dependent variables, which is a really important concept that will be consistent throughout the semester. Then looking at the ways that researchers actually collect data. So you've been exposed to different sampling strategies, but now you're going to be introduced to different methods of data collection and research methods. A very quick overview. You could spend a whole semester talking about the different data collection methods I'm going to introduce you to. You're just going to get a really quick overview of different types of experiments and correlational studies. Then finally, this lecture will end with what is statistics, which is what we're really going to be focused on for the rest of the semester.
So before we can talk about different types of research methodology, it's important that you understand what an independent and a dependent variable is. So essentially, the independent variable identifies the variable in the relationship that's being examined or in the study that is known to be the predictor. So the independent variable is really the cause, the supposed cause of whatever it is you're examining. So independent variables can be manipulated conditions in an experiment. So if you have one group of people that gets a drug and one group of people that doesn't get anything, the drug is being manipulated. Also, independent variables can be pre-existing groups. So if you expect to see differences, again, in harassment and discrimination based on ethnic groups would be your independent variable. You think that there's going to be differences in those experiences based on ethnicity, or ethnicity predicts those experiences. And in that case, your independent variable of ethnicity would be a pre-existing group that wasn't manipulated by the researcher. Now, dependent variables are the outcome in the relationship that you're examining. So they're usually the measured impact or the outcome of whatever was manipulated or whatever group is being examined. So in the drug example, you've got the control group and the experimental group. One group gets the drug, the other one doesn't. The independent variable would be the drug. Well, what depends on the drug? Well, whatever condition it is you're studying. So if you're testing a drug that improves pain, well, then pain would be your dependent variable that depends on the drug. In the ethnicity example, if you're looking to see if there's differences in harassment and discrimination experiences based on ethnicity, ethnicity is your independent variable because those experiences of harassment and discrimination depend on ethnicity. So those experiences of harassment and discrimination would be your dependent variable. Again, depends on your independent variable of ethnicity in that example. So here's another example. If a researcher thinks that small groups are going to be more cohesive or going to, get along and work better together than large groups, then the independent variable would be the group size. And you'd have two levels of that. So you'd have a small group and a large group. And that could be manipulated by the researcher or based on pre-existing work groups. Then the dependent variable in this example would be the level of cohesion, because cohesion depends on group size according to this conclusion or hypothesis. So now that I've introduced you to the concepts of different types of data and independent versus dependent variables, we can discuss some different common data collection methods. So I'm going to start off with the most complex and the strongest data collection method, which is called a true experiment. And true experiments are the only type of data collection method that allows you to make causal inferences, or in other words, saying your independent variable causes your dependent variable. Now, in order to have a true experiment, the researcher must do three things. So three criteria need to be met. There needs to be random assignment, manipulation, and control. So random assignment basically means that you take your hopefully random sample, and you divide them into groups randomly. Then manipulation gets at the fact that the researcher needs to manipulate the independent variable within those groups. So typically each group gets a different level of the independent variable that the researcher is interested in comparing. Then the control aspect is the fact that within the study, the only thing that can differ between those groups is the manipulation of the independent variable. You want everything else to be similar. You want to control for everything else that could possibly have an impact on whatever you're measuring. So for instance, if we look at this study, right? So random assignment, manipulation, and control. If we were doing a true experiment to assess the impact of caffeine on performance among Zappos employees, we could randomly select a sample of Zappos employees and then randomly assign half to group 1 and half to group 2. And group 1 would drink this Hyper Cafe coffee twice a day during the workday for a month, and then group 2 would drink this Trader Joe's decaf coffee twice a day during the workday for a month, and then you could assess differences in performance between those two groups. Now, the control aspect is partially related to random assignment. So, by randomly assigning different people to groups, you're controlling for pre-existing differences. So, the hope through random assignment is that you're going to have, an equal distribution or roughly equal distribution of individual differences in group 1 and in group 2. And think about some individual differences that could impact this study, right? So some people may already be coffee drinkers, so they're going to be less susceptible to the impact of caffeine. Some people may already be better performers, right? So that could have an impact on the outcome of performance that you're measuring. So by randomly assigning people to different groups, you could hope that you kind of have evenly distributed the different levels of performance and caffeine tolerance and all the other things that could have an impact on your results. Now, control is also inherent in the way that you collect your data and the way that you conduct your study. So with control, look at these, both of these groups are drinking coffee, right? So you don't want to have any suspicion that if you decided to give one group coffee and the other group gets nothing, you don't want to be suspicious that maybe the fact that group one was drinking something, be it coffee or not, was having an impact on performance, and because the second group wasn't drinking anything at all. So you also want to mitigate the effects of the groups knowing which group they're in, right? So you could be tricky. So you could control for purposeful contamination of results of people who are resentful that they're not getting coffee twice a day. So by giving both groups something that seems to be the same, right? They're both drinking a hot brown beverage called coffee. They don't know if they're getting caffeine or not. So you're not going to have any purposeful contamination of people knowing if they're getting coffee or not and acting accordingly. So you're controlling for those things. You could also control for the placebo effect by giving both groups what seems to be coffee, because maybe the people in the group who know they're getting coffee would perform more because they feel like they're caffeinated even if they're not. So again, controlling for other things. Another way that this example would be enacting some control would be that both of these different groups are getting this different manipulation are Zappos employees. So you're controlling for the type of organization that they're coming from as well, so that you could be more confident if you see that group one has better performance, that's due to the hyper cafe coffee that they were drinking and not the anything else that can impact performance. Now, a quasi experiment is kind of like an experiment, but it's usually missing one element of manipulation, control, or random assignment. So I'll talk about two very common types of quasi experiments. One is the pre-test, post-test. So that involves manipulation, but there's no random assignment, and the same group is measured twice, before and after. And this is handy because it allows you to control pre-existing differences. So instead of relying on random selection and random assignment in hopes that you've got, two groups that represent, for example, the same caffeine tolerance and the same level of performance, you can compare one group to themselves and you're controlling for pre-existing differences in terms of caffeine tolerance and performance because those differences are there at time 1 and time 2. So, for example, you could take a random sample of employees, you could measure their performance, then you could give them caffeine for a month and measure their performance and compare their performance before and after drinking this coffee. That would be a pre-test, post-test design. Now, this is a good type of study if you want to, again, control for those pre-existing individual differences, but sometimes the pre-test can have an impact on the post-test, and that can be problematic. So, for example, if you are measuring a pre-test, post-test study looking at the effects of attending a study group on quiz scores. So you give students the quiz, then you give them the study group, then you give them the quiz again. Well, chances are, even if the study group was complete garbage, they're going to do better on the second quiz because they've already taken that quiz. So the pre-test, post-test design can be problematic if there is a fear that taking the pre-test is going to have an impact on the post-test despite any kind of intervention or manipulation that happens in between those measures. So another common type of quasi-experiment is pre-existing groups design. So this may or may not include manipulation. It often doesn't. Usually the independent variable is the basis for the pre-existing groups that are selected, and often involves a lack of control and a lack of random assignment because you're relying on pre-existing groups. You cannot randomly assign your participants to groups. So, for example, instead of having a randomly assigned group drink caffeinated coffee and a randomly assigned group drink non-caffeinated coffee, and then comparing performance across those two groups, you could simply measure performance and compare performance between those who drink coffee already and those who don't drink coffee. Think about some of the problems with that, though, and why you can't make a causal inference in that situation. Well, first of all, people who drink coffee may be inherently different than people who don't in terms of things that impact their performance. Maybe people who drink coffee are spending time drinking coffee and not performing, so they're not really doing better even if the coffee is giving them more energy because they're wasting time. Or maybe the people who don't drink coffee are not drinking coffee because they already have energy, right? So maybe they don't feel the need to drink coffee because they're getting adequate sleep. They're not trying to compensate for something. So they're going to do better with performance. Even if coffee enhances performance, it doesn't in the study because those who are drinking coffee have reasons for drinking coffee that mitigate performance. So in this example, you really wouldn't get a clear picture of the impact of drinking caffeinated coffee on performance because you're comparing pre-existing groups that probably already have pre-existing differences in terms of performance. So a very simple and common data collection strategy in human subjects research involves surveys. So surveys can be done over the phone or in person on paper or even conducted online, which is really handy because you can do really broad outreach with online surveys and you don't have to manually enter data. It's just there for you. So it's really quick and easy. So surveys can have multiple different types of questions, but the broadest categorization of survey questions would be closed-ended and open-ended. So for closed-end questions, this would be like true or false, multiple choice, and Likert scales that have you rate something on a scale of like 1 to 10. So closed-end questions just have specific responses to choose from. But the good thing about these is that they're really quick, easy to analyze, and really straightforward. But the con of closed-end questions is that they're limiting. You don't really get rich information. You're limited by the questions you ask and the response options that you provide. So another type of survey question is an open-ended question. So the pro of open-ended questions is that they provide really rich information. So for instance, I was doing a study with a public transportation organization measuring safety climate and safety perceptions and accidents and injuries. And we created this huge, big, awesome survey assessing all sorts of different things. But in the open-ended comments at the end, we got rich information that we didn't capture with our numeric scales that we came up with. So I found out by looking at the open-ended responses that to cut costs, they were attaching a fan to the back of the buses and blowing all the debris forward and then sweeping it out instead of hiring a cleaning crew to come in. So the bus drivers were coming in the morning and turning on the heat and being blasted with debris. We also found out that bus drivers and different employees were getting staph infections because of the lack of cleanliness on the buses. And we didn't assess cleanliness at all. All we assessed were, accidents and injuries, but nothing to do with sanitation issues. So those open-ended questions really gave us some rich information that we didn't capture with the closed-end questions. Now, the con of open-ended questions is that they're very time-consuming, difficult to analyze, and you risk irrelevancy. We had some people who just went on and on and on and were just complaining about things that were completely irrelevant to our study, but a team of researchers still had to go through and code those responses for themes and figure out what was going on and make sense of that data. So it's very time-consuming. Now, some tips for surveys. So broad outreach is really important. You want to minimize sampling bias by either, calling people during all hours, also obtaining phone numbers outside of the phone book because landline users may be different from cell phone users, right? So broad outreach is important, especially in phone surveys where a lot of times, like election polls are often based on landlines and not everybody has a landline, so you need to be careful. That's why online research is really great because broad outreach is very, very easy. Also, you want to make sure that you have a random sample. So again, minimizing that sampling bias, making sure that your sample represents the population. So randomly selecting people to participate. Also, you want to make sure that your survey is short so that people are more inclined to participate. It doesn't take a whole lot of time. You want to make sure that questions are specific and simple so that people reading them are all having the same perception of what you're asking. You don't want to make it ambiguous so that some people are thinking one way and some people are thinking another way when they're responding to your questions. You also want to make sure that you have really objective and not leading questions because you don't want to lead people in a certain direction. You want to make sure that they're actually responding in a way that they feel. So, for example, instead of saying, "How disgusting is Kraft American cheese?" Well, that's pretty leading. You could say, "Rate your opinion of Kraft American cheese on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being disgusting and 5 being like very much." So, again, avoid leading questions that make the participants kind of understand or get some insight into what you're hoping their responses will look like. Also, you need to make sure that your survey is anonymous, especially if you're surveying employees. I've run into this time and time again where employees are afraid to provide honest data because they're afraid of retaliation. So if you can promise that their responses are anonymous and nobody will be able to link their individual responses to their identity, they're more inclined to give you accurate, honest responses and to participate in the first place. So it's really important that anonymity is guaranteed. So another basic data collection method is observation, or physically observing the behavior of interest and recording observations with scales and open-ended records. So this is kind of common in human subjects research, and it's really nice because when you do observation, you don't have to rely on your participant to recall everything that you're interested in because some behaviors are not very deliberate or memorable. So, for instance, if you try to ask somebody for a job analysis to recall the process of unloading freight, they're going to have a difficult time doing that because they do that process all the time and they don't really think about each step involved. Also, for instance, if you wanted to understand or ask somebody how much time they spent looking at a display in the store, it would be difficult for them to really recall or adequately or accurately assess how much time they spent looking at the display. So instead, you could use observation. So instead of asking people to indicate how long they looked at a store display, you could just observe and record how long they looked at the display with great accuracy, not having to worry about inaccurate recall. Now, the problem with observation is that it's very time consuming and can be invasive. And in the workplace, it's often difficult to get permission to observe employees if you're a third party researcher. Also, subjectivity can interfere with the accuracy of observation if you're observing something that is not time or numerically based. Problems really arise when people view the same events differently or when the same person views the same events differently at different times. So, to avoid this inconsistency and inaccuracy, one should train the raters who are doing observation to use standardized numeric metrics for ratings that all the observers use and understand. And having this data collection worksheet with clear metrics for assessment will minimize these observer biases and inaccuracies and make observation more reliable. Also, people who are aware that they're being observed tend to act differently, especially in the workplace where employees want to appear high performing. So, if you're doing observation of people, especially employees, you should use covert observation so that you will get an accurate picture of your sample's behavior. They don't know you're watching them. Now, another type of data collection that's somewhat common in business and very, very easy is automatic data collection. So this is just data that's collected through systems in place for other purposes. So like tracking sales, purchasing habits, even employee absences. Automatic data is really easy to collect and is typically collected for the entire population of interest in business situations. So there's no need for a random sample. You just have all the data that you need. So, an example of automatic data is the purchases of rewards members at grocery stores. So, we all know that rewards members' purchases are tracked, but did you know that the data is used for something called segmentation? So, research suggests that on average, 75% of grocery store profit comes from 30% of the customers. So, again, 75% of the profit coming from 30% of the customers. So the reward card data identifies those best loyal customers, that 30% that's spending the most money and are there the most often, and concentrates aisle space, the prime aisle space, to the products purchased by those best loyal customers who make up the majority of their profit. Rewards card data is also used for targeted coupons for frequently bought items. And that's just automatic data that's being collected very easily and can be used for pretty important things when it comes to sales. So now that I have given you the quick and dirty overview of research methods, so different types of sampling strategies, what is data, what are different types of data collection methods, now you're prepared to tackle what is statistics for the rest of the semester. And just to give you a quick preview, there's two different fields of statistics, broadly speaking. There's descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. This class is mostly focused on descriptive statistics, where we're just trying to summarize and organize data from a sample or population to make sense of it. So we are going to be looking at examining proportions or percentages and frequencies of different characteristics within samples and populations. We're going to look at this semester at central tendency, so the mean, the median, and the mode to help us describe data, and also variability, so how spread out are scores, how consistent or inconsistent are scores within my sample for the variable I'm interested in. Inferential statistics is really just taking the sample that you're able to examine and making conclusions about the population that you're actually interested in. So remember, typically you don't have access to the entire population. You have to take a sample from that population, study that sample, and then make assumptions about the population based on what you observe in that sample. So you can use past data or a sample to assess the probability of future events. You can use estimation to estimate what you think the value would be in the population based on a sample. You can use forecasting to take past values and make predictions about future values. And even though we don't cover it in this class, you can use hypothesis testing to determine if your independent variables in research have a significant effect on dependent variables in research.